Today I'll be demonstrating how I color a strawberry in Scratchboard using this reference image. The supplies I'll be using are the ampersand inks that are designed specifically for Scratchboard and Clayboard. I'm sorry I have them off the screen here, but I have inserted a picture so that you can see what they look like. There's also a link in the description below. When I scratched the strawberry, I made it a little lighter in some areas because as I add the colored inks over top, it will move some of the remaining black ink around, which will make the overall color darker. I have a little plastic mixing tray that I use to mix my colors. I'll be working on the leaves first, so I'm using the yellow and green inks. Before I start to apply any of the colored inks, I use my little desk vacuum to get rid of any loose ink dust that was caused from my scratching. As you can see, the gray that is all over my desk is actually from ink dust that has stuck to the surface of my desk over time. You can clean it with alcohol or Mr. Clean magic erasers are a good way to scrub that off. Every once in a while I will do that. Another thing I do is use a Kleenex hand towel to dab up any of the really fine dust that my vacuum didn't pick up. And there is some on that Scratchboard. You can try knocking the board onto the surface to try and get the particles loose, but I find that the easiest way is just to dab with a hand towel to get those little fine particles. I'm doing it very carefully too because I don't want to mark up the Scratchboard surface. I'll be using a number 2 brush, watercolor brush. I tend to keep my watercolor brushes separate from my ink brushes. They're all watercolor brushes though, I should make that clear. And I just don't want to mix my brushes that I use for ink with my brushes that I use for watercolor. So this is one that I keep specifically for my ink. You'll notice I also had a little bottle there. All that is just plain water. I dilute the inks a little bit. They come out of the bottles very intense. That's okay sometimes, but for this piece, because I am going over a very finely scratched three-dimensional surface or look, I want to try and keep that as much as possible. By diluting the inks, that helps. I'll keep the reference image close so that I can compare the color I mix with the actual color. I don't need them to be identical, but I would like them to be similar. I also have a piece of watercolor paper handy that you can see up there. I'm testing out my color mixing before I actually apply it to the Scratchboard. I also keep that hand towel that I used to dab up the dust with nearby, and I'll wipe off any excess ink that's on my brush onto the towel. Applying color is a time-consuming process because it's not just putting down the color once. There are going to be many layers of coloring, and there's also going to be scratching in between. I was just indicating there that, as you can see, I'm just applying the yellow ink to the leaves, but as you can see, as I wipe my brush, some of that black ink is coming off as I'm applying the ink, and when I wipe it, you can see that the black ink has moved and shifted and it's moved onto my brush. So I keep wiping it off so that I'm not muddying the color, and then I can add more color over top that is not contaminated by the black ink. Otherwise, it would become very dark. And I know I'm not showing this all that well, but as I'm mixing colors, I'm picking up maybe a little bit of the green, with the yellow when I'm applying the yellow, and now I'm doing the opposite. I'm mainly applying the green, but sometimes I'll pick up a little yellow with it if it's not quite the right shade of green. And I don't mix them in a separate well. I am just mixing them within the brush. So I'll pick up a little bit of yellow with my brush, move directly to the green and pick up the green, and then I test that mixing on my watercolor paper. If I'm doing a larger area and there needs to be more mixing, I will use a separate well in my mixing palette and then actually combine the inks there. It takes a little while for the ink to dry on the scratchboard, so while the yellow and green are drying for the leaves, I'm going to start applying the red for the strawberry. I'm just using the color straight out of the bottle. It's actually kind of a bluish red when you use it directly out of the bottle, and I'm not going to want that, to be the color in the end. So as I start applying the red, at times I will dip my brush into the yellow a little bit to pick it up, so that way it's not more of a kind of a pinky color and it's more of a true red. So I'm sorry you can't see me picking up that yellow in there, but I am adding a little bit of yellow with my brush and testing it out on the paper until I see the color, the ink coming out the way that I want it to. I've also added some water in there to dilute it so that it's not as intense. A large surface like this too, well, it's relatively large to the piece that I'm working on, will move a lot of black ink around, so it will even come out darker than what my test color looks like on the paper. But as you can see here, the yellow that I picked up with my brush is slightly separate in spots from the red, and that's fine with me. That's exactly what I want. I don't need to have a perfect mix that's even throughout the entire layer, especially when it comes to something organic like a strawberry, vegetables, flowers, things like that. That's not how they look in nature. Their color shifts within even a small object like a strawberry. You see a little bit more of a yellowy tone along the top there where it's a little bit lighter that I scratched out for the dimension of the strawberry, and that's perfect. That works out for me. Now I will be adding more ink layers to it and that will change it again, but the underlying tone of it will come through, which is really nice. Another thing I noticed, I noticed this with roses and with strawberries, for example. The leaves will have kind of a brownish color, but it's actually a red mingling with the green that's there. Since they're complementary of one another, it tends to come out or look like a neutral color. So instead of painting a brown, all I simply do is paint a little bit of the red over top of the green leaf, and I get the exact effect that I see in nature. Of course, the leaves here are too dark in comparison to the reference image, and I will be scratching them again to get them more to the level that we see in the reference image. Again, I don't try to achieve perfection. I just want it to look as close as possible. One way I can tell it's safe to scratch again is if the temperature of the colored ink area is the same as the temperature of the scratchboard that I have not colored. And that's what I'm testing here, is to see if I can go ahead and scratch the strawberry. It's not quite ready yet, still need it to dry a little bit more. The leaves are probably getting close to being ready to scratch again. If you start scratching too soon while the inks are still wet, you are not going to get sharp little lines. They'll be ragged. You'll get different effects. Maybe that might be something you want to go for with your subject. But when I'm rendering things a little bit more realistically, I need to count on how the scratches will come out. So it's really important for me to make sure that they're dry. One thing I noticed in life when I created this still life, the more the image was receding into the background, the white of the lace actually started to look a little bit more bluish. It didn't really come out that way in the photograph, but that's okay. I'm going to do or add the blue to it to make it look like it did in life, because that's what I recalled seeing, and I think that that makes a difference. So that's exactly what I'm doing, is trying to mix a blue to the shade that I recall, very faint. I've added quite a bit of water here to dilute it down so it's a very soft shade of blue. And I'll be applying it to what would be the far region of the lace work that's laying on the flat surface. So it's just along this back line. Now this is much bluer than I remember, and that's okay, because that's the wonder of Scratchboard, is I can scratch it and bring it down into a softer shade of blue. It's really important when taking still life references for yourself that you note little things like this. Photography is a wonder in the sense of being able to capture something that would take us a while to actually render, like let's say flowers. When you try to do flowers in Scratchboard, it's a very long process, and the flowers would not look nearly the same as they did on the day that you started. So one becomes very dependent on photographic images, but photographs don't always tell the whole story. And so it's really important that you take sketches or make notes, or even do some thumbnails of the image that you want to capture, because there are nuances, I find at least, there are nuances that you just don't get from a photograph. Now I'm letting the blue ink dry, and I've gone back to scratching the leaves to bring them down in shade. So as you can see, scratching out the green brings up the white, which softens the green quite a bit. And if you haven't seen any of my other videos, let me explain what I'm using here. This is an X-Acto blade holder with a medical number 11 scalpel blade in there. I've wrapped tacky putty around there, around the blade, to protect my fingers, and I've only exposed the very tip of the scalpel blade to do the work. It's just such a sharp blade that I just don't want to risk getting my fingers cut if there's a slip, and I find that putting something around there to protect it makes me feel a lot safer about what I'm using. I'm sorry though, it makes it a little bit more difficult for you to see exactly what I'm doing, but you can, if you squint and look really closely, you can see the tip of the scalpel blade. I have other videos where I've taken that off so you can actually see the full blade. I'm just brushing away the little bits of colored ink. They are not the same as the black ink. I find that the black ink that's on the Scratchboard tends to, when it gets wet, it dilutes a lot easier, and it's a softer, a finer ink. When I scratch the colored inks, they tend to be a little bit less fine, and so when I brush them away, there's really no chance of streaking them or causing any damage to the Scratchboard. So I will sometimes use a vacuum if it's a larger area though. Since these are such smaller areas, just brushing them away with my cotton glove makes it a whole lot easier. And I am using the cotton gloves to protect the board from the oils in my fingers. I don't want to mark up the black Scratchboard ink. And I've begun scratching out the highlights again in the strawberry. I always go for the shiniest, the strongest points first, and then I work out from there. As I'm working on this strawberry, I'm noticing some little things I might have missed on the lace or just not really what makes me happy, I guess. So I'm making those adjustments and correcting those things to make them look more like I'd like them to. And the blue ink that I applied earlier is now dry, so it's time to, yeah, it's time to start scratching it. I always try to check and make sure that it's dry and not assume that it is. You can usually tell right away when you start scratching anyways, but it is a good habit to check. And I'm leaving it a little darker at the top. I'm just scratching the lower end of it so that it's like more of a fade into the background. And now it's going to be time for me to start scratching the strawberry overall, getting more of the seed highlights, the highlights, and then shaping it so that it has a more of a three-dimensional effect again, because applying that color flattened it, obviously. And this will take some time. I'm going to do this off screen, and then I will come back here and we can take a look at it when it's ready for the next application of color. Okay, I've scratched a lot more of the highlights back in. I've done more of a, given it a three-dimensional rendering. I've untouched the lower part of the strawberry so that it keeps the darks that I had from before. And now I'm adding a little bit more water to my red, so that way it's diluted even further and it's not going to be as intense or opaque and cover up all of the work that I have done already. Just testing that color, seeing if I need to add anything further to it. And it looks good to me, so I'm going to go ahead and apply it in one even layer across the entire strawberry. It can be a little disheartening sometimes when you apply a color over all of your work, because now it starts to cover all the highlights. You're going to have to go back in and scratch them out all over again. But even still, you can see that in this second application of ink, it already has a lot more dimensionality than it did in the first one. And while that dries, we can work on the leaves again. I'm thinking that this will be the last layer of colored ink that I'll be adding to the leaves. Once I apply this here and then scratch out some highlights, I think they'll be done. The leaves didn't take quite as much work as the strawberry. The strawberry, to get that nice rich red and depth, takes a little bit more effort. I'm now ready to scratch the strawberry again once it's dry. Since you've already seen this process, I'm going to do this off screen and I'll meet back with you here to show you what it looks like when it's done. And here it is. A final scratching of the strawberry has been done. I'm not going to be applying any more colored inks. I've gone in and I've scratched out all of the highlights again, especially the larger parts. I've made them a little more dramatic to make the strawberry look shiny, including adding a reflection of the lace at the bottom of the strawberry. By scratching the top side of it a little bit with tiny scratch marks, I've given it dimensionality. I start to become a little bit nitpicky at this point. I notice things like the shadow might be a little too dark or needs a little bit of adjustment. Here I know the leaf that's hanging down needs to be adjusted just a tiny bit. But when I do this, I know that my image is done because I'm not making any major changes. Nothing that anybody looking at it would think was, a significant improvement or distraction. To me, it's finished. So here we are at the end. I hope you enjoyed coloring the strawberry with me, and I hope this encourages you to pull out those inks and start coloring your scratch boards. Thank you for joining me, and I hope I'll see you in future videos.